The resolution of John's vision begins as such. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. This is what is recorded in the 20th chapter of the book of Revelation. Immediately, we are led to understand that the consummation of the vision reveals that the present life is not to be reconstructed, nor is it some form of reordering of present attitudes. John presents a complete transformation, a totally new form of life and existence. It is to be understood that the old will be completely removed in favor of a transformed life. It will be a life that no longer experiences separation from God or separation in any form. Since separation is the origin of pain and sorrow, these too will have no place in the transformed life. John observed this as he saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Then he continues, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. This transformation would mean union with God, a thing that great saints and mystics have always held as the culmination of life, the destiny of the soul. At this point, John is then shown that this transformed life is one that we merely participate in. We do not create it. He understands this when he hears the voice of God proclaim himself God as the originator and author of the process. For he continues by saying, And he who is seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. It is a process that is entered into, not one that is accomplished by our own creative process or power. Nor is it purchased through some atoning act. It is new life given without payment. But this does not mean that it is attained passively. A person must actively participate to grasp this newly transformed existence. John tells us that what he has now to understand is that the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. It is not that being good and merely doing good things gives one access to this new life as a reward, but that people who do the condemned things are those who have either actively or passively not participated in the making of all things new, the very thing God is doing. So only now do we begin to gain an experience of just what that union with God, that transformed life, will appear to be. For John continues, Then came one of the seven angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like jasper and clear crystal. It is provocative to realize that, unlike some seeming absorption into a cosmic consciousness, John is allowed to retain a self-identity. It is not that the ego is to be dissolved in this process, but rather that it will take on its rightful position as the conscious observer of the transformation of the complete self, the transformation even of creation. The ego, that conscious identity, has often usurped its role and attempted to be the center of its own created cosmos. Since this was a false position, and since the true position of a greater self, of an image of God, of an imago Dei, must be attained as our true salvation and destiny, then the ego must be dealt with before health can be found. When the ego took over the unwarranted role as the center of the self, a natural reaction occurred, allowing that the only alternative was that it must be destroyed, so that health and wholeness, the destiny of the psyche, that destiny which is to be the image and likeness of God, could be manifested. These opposites always attack. We're looking for integration. But when we become too one-sided on one side, we take on the pendulum side. So the ego took on a role as the center. A reaction would have to occur. A reaction that would say you no longer can be. But like so many times, it's an overreaction, an attempt to destroy the ego rather than to bring it into a rightful position. Human history has shown that overreaction. We observe such moves toward destroying the ego both in natural religion and in psychosis. Natural religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, which are based on millennia of thoughtful observation more than perceived revelation, recognized the ego's arrogant error and took on the position that the ego must essentially be destroyed to make way for the true self. The rituals and doctrines then put forth formed a boundary to protect the individual along the path of self-denial. However, the concept of egolessness was still merely and ultimately neurotic. It's a neurotic resolution to the former aggrandizement of the personal identity. As a debasement of who we are, it was merely the opposite impulse of aggrandizement, and as such, still was one-sided and avoided wholeness. For the individual who did not have a religious system to grasp hold of and protect him, this same disillusionment of the ego, this dissolution of the ego, was what would occur then in psychosis, as the greater self needed to deal with the upstart ego. In this case, it was not a neurotic one-sidedness that was experienced, but a loss of rationality and reason. The loss of self described in naturalistic religions and in psychosis is not the answer. The loss of self described by John is one in which the ego stands back as conscious observer and as such participates in the work of transformation. It is strong, the ego is strong and present, but it is humbly submissive and takes its rightful place in who we are as images of God, once again our destiny. To become in the image and likeness of God and dwell with Him in the new heaven and the new earth. This may be the consummation of life, at least as far as Scripture and human knowledge can ascertain. What happens afterwards, when living in this new creation, God has not told us. What life is like once union with God is attained, and life in a new creation progresses, is obviously of little importance to us at this stage. This renewed life, this new transformed life, may be the end. But what is the beginning of the process? How do we get there? What we find in John's vision is an explication now of that process. And it is the explication of the end of a very long process known as salvation history. We will find when we encounter the vision of the opening of the seven seals that what is being revealed is the end of God's plan for salvation, for the healing of creation, for the bringing about of the plan for union with creation through humankind. But that plan for salvation began long before, even at the very tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the division into opposites. What had begun as a sort of infantile unity and relationship between God and the original human being was soon developed into a life of individuality and division. What had been a form of warm embrace would now be characterized by a relationship of perceived distance and paternal mentoring. The human being, which once knew God, now needed to believe that God had more wisdom than himself, and that obedience to that wisdom would lead him toward the path of healing. Faith and obedience became the hallmark of a relationship with God, especially obedience. The life of obedience would define religion and life through this early period of development, but it would never be the manner by which the consummation would be attained. St. Paul would describe this period of development by using the images of a pupil and a mentor, or a custodian, a concept with which John would have been acquainted. But St. Paul would also tell us that a time would come when we would need no longer rely on external obedience, but would need to take on a deeper form of responsibility to become mature, to then fulfill our destiny. Individual human development is a microcosm of just such a process. We observe the human infant as a unique individual. But in practical experience, it is apparent that the infant experiences a sort of unity with the parent and the perceived surrounding environment. Certainly, this is the empathic experience of the parent. It is one of the early parental disappointments when this empathic bonding begins to diminish as the child's ego identity develops. It is this empathic unity that is so attractive and so strong that its loss has prompted many women to forget the misery of pregnancy and childbirth and once again desire a child. As the ego develops and individuality progresses, The naive child now needs to be given boundaries and directions to protect and guide him through the exigencies of life. It is as simple as realizing that without boundaries and guidance, the small child would see no problem with eating poisonous foods and crossing the street without looking in both directions. There is no survival value in freedom from obedience and laws. However, there comes a time when laws and obedience become constrictive to the process of living, and especially living into one's personal destiny. It is then that these must be cast off in order to progress. But such casting off and progression does not imply a rejection of what has been learned. It is not some modern adolescent rebellion. Rather, it is better seen as an incorporation of what has been learned, so that it might now be such a part of the person that he is now both a representative of such learning and free to move beyond its concrete restraints. No wise person, when they consider themselves mature and ready to take on personal responsibilities, would then find crossing the street without looking both ways or eating poisonous food an attractive possibility. So it is that a time comes when, as we read in the letter to the Hebrews, it is time to move from childish milk to mature meat. This is the time that St. Paul describes as no longer living under the obedience of the law and now living the life of the Spirit. We also see this as a parallel within the Song of Songs, the wisdom of Solomon's, the Song of Solomon. When the watchmen, who at one time were of useful assistance to the maiden locating her beloved, at a later time become active impediments to her. During individual development, this is a natural process. There comes a time when each person finds they must strike out on their own to find their own destiny. Mythologically, this has been seen as the hero's journey. It is a time when to merely mouth what has been learned, to merely think as one's parents have thought, to be just a part of the community and family, is oppressive. The time has come to be an individual. In inner terms, the hero's journey is a time when the ego is being developed and strengthened. But once this has occurred, it is time for the ego to submit itself to the greater demand of allowing the full self to come forth, that the image of God may conform to the likeness of God. It is a path that only can occur with great awareness and humility. Such awareness and humility lend themselves to suffering. So many fight this move, a move often described in the midlife crisis. But to fight this move is not merely to reject development and maintain a seemingly happy but undeveloped life, to avoid suffering. Rather, to avoid suffering and to reject this move is met with depression. The choice then is between rejecting life and entering depression, or accepting the move toward destiny and encountering true suffering. So it is that we hear the successful and well-respected 13th century poet Dante tell of his own midlife crisis that compelled him to take a journey toward wholeness. He begins his great work, the Divine Comedy, with these words: midway through the journey of life. This is followed by an excursion then into hell entered through an arch inscribed with the proclamation, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." This pattern is likewise observed in a literary precursor to Dante's work, The Voyage of St. Brendan the Navigator. In this work we find Brendan living an ordered life in the middle of Ireland when a journeyer arrives to tell of finding the fabled Isle of the Saints. Brendan is then given a vision of the fulfilled life, of touching paradise, which so grasps him that he abandons his ordered life in favor of the rigors of the sea in a small boat. So whether it is John's vision given by Jesus, or Dante's travels in the Divine Comedy, or Brendan's journey, the message is the same. Suffering and trials lie before the one who submits themselves to finding paradise, to the one seeking the beatific vision, to the consummation of the divine marriage. If the book of Revelation is, as I propose, a description of just such a process, then it is also likely following the pattern that has been observed over the past 2 millennia of the process of spiritual development. We have seen in the literature of Christian mysticism that we can encapsulate the spiritual development of the individual into 3 categories: the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way. Others have called these the way of beginners, proficients, and perfect. Whatever the term, the experience of life is similar, and the tasks the same, with development focused upon the final accomplishment of unity of the individual with God. It is reasonable that John, being known as the mystical disciple, would likely have such a revelation, especially if it was also introducing something new to him and to the world. Dreams and visions infrequently occur that do not add to a person's knowledge and experience. What would have been added here is that this developmental process is not merely for the individual, but for all creation. The individual here is truly acting as a microcosm of a macrocosmic action, the development of creation toward its own glorification in God. It is a new glorified creation. However, the book of Revelation does not easily present itself in such a nice threefold structure leading to culmination. Rather, it is comprised of a series of 8 visions. These 8 comprise a literary structure, like many a good dream, of an introduction and a conclusion, sandwiching between them 6 sets of visions made up of 7 events each. The introduction, revisited in chapters 4 and 5, is followed by a vision of the letters delivered to the churches. Seals then being opened, trumpets blown, then 7 unnumbered visions, giving way to bowls poured out, and finally to another set of 7 unnumbered visions. This might seem confusing if it were not for the fact that each set appears to end up in the same place, a heavenly scene. Then each heavenly scene seems to lead to the next set of events, which in many circumstances appear very similar to the earlier circumstances. It might be confusing if we were not to view this as a developmental process. We know from the observation of child and adult development that we all tend to flow through stages of life that appear to recapitulate earlier stages. Adolescence has been called a recapitulation of the terrible twos. Even if adolescence is seen as a rather recent experience in human society, for prior to this, the person merely left childhood and became an adult, the experience of recapitulation of the 2-year-old's primary narcissism is, in adolescence, an instinctual urge to move toward independence. The small child is practicing their independence, much to the dismay of the parent, a practice that is to then give way to true independence. These stages, when completed, often have a sense of accomplishment, a sense of accomplishment that then is soon erased as the next stage is completed. Merely ask the 8th grader who briefly feels superior to classmates in earlier grades only then to enter high school as a freshman, and the experience of being that lower classman starts over. The same holds true for the high school senior who becomes a freshman in college, or the college senior entering the workforce. Accomplishment and rest soon gives way to a renewed journey. We see that life is made up not so much of a straight line, but a seeming sense of oscillation, a sense of going forward only to seemingly go back. But going back is truly still going forward. It is like climbing a mountain in a spiral fashion. You end up at the same place many times, only higher up. Often we do not like this fact. The small child enjoys growing older, of seeing himself higher up the mountain. But the older adult often has lost this appreciation. The common midlife crisis is just such an experience. If that midlife adult could find the child's appreciation for progress, the crisis would be averted. However, many develop a spiritual acrophobia and wish to descend. This is probably due to the belief that the top of the mountain is merely a jumping off point into a deadly oblivion of non-existence. A belief erased now by the disclosure at the end of John's vision. With this understanding of human development in hand, and applied to the progression within John's vision, we may get a better understanding of the process of development that creation and the individual is to follow as it moves towards glorification, and likewise, which we as individuals are to experience as we progress in the same manner. And so we may now be able to understand what we encounter in John's vision. His vision is of a process by which God will bring creation and the individual to a transformed life, united to God's own life. It is a corporate vision and an individual dream. It is a goal. Its goal is transformation and a new life. With the book of Revelation, we find ourselves beginning in the middle, much as we do with Dante and the Divine Comedy. We find ourselves at the edge of life, where maturity demands a new risk, where the now established adult ego must submit itself to the process of realizing that it is not the all in all, but only a part of the whole person. We find ourselves, with Dante, entering our own dark wood, finding our own gate inscribed, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." We begin our journey to wholeness. But first we're reminded of what the ego was to already have incorporated prior to embarking upon this journey into the depths of the self and the spirit. We are reminded of the virtues and attitudes necessary for the journey to be successfully traversed. Reminded of the requisite virtues and attitudes outlined in the letters to the 7 churches.